Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to our continuing ninth grade course where we were covering Homer's The Odyssey. Now, we had a little bit of a hiatus there during the school year, but we're going to jump right back in and try to finish The Odyssey at a relatively good pace. Now, if you remember last time, we ended after the first third of the Odyssey, because I've split us up into three sections, essentially. And the first section ended right when Odysseus escaped Polyphemus and all the dangers with Cyclops. And more specifically, it ended right as he was being cursed by Polyphemus. And that curse is what, of course, famously is going to cause him, or, in part going to cause him to not be able to return home to Ithaca. So as he leaves the land of the Cyclopses, after he tries to make his sacrifice to Zeus and it is essentially rejected, we then have Book 10. And Book 10 is a book that I took just a small section from because I wanted to discuss essentially what the main character, if you want, of Book 10, but also the main kind of motif or the new sort of feature of the text that we see here, which is fundamentally magic, or the idea of magic in the Odyssey and in Greek epic poetry here. So for book 10, we're going to read this long summary because, again, we're not looking at the entirety of the Odyssey. We don't have the time to do that, unfortunately, in class. So what we are instead going to do is read the segments, the small little segments, summary segments, and then we're going to read close reading passages, some longer, some shorter, answering the reading questions as we go along, and then working on this reflection for books 10 to 16 once we finish those. Okay. So let's start real quick. Book 10. The summary says this: Odysseus and his men next land on the island of Aeolus, the Wind King, and stay with him a month. To extend his hospitality, Aeolus gives Odysseus two parting gifts: a fair west wind that will blow the fleet of ships towards Ithaca, and a great bag holding all the unfavorable stormy winds. Okay. So another kind of well-known stop on Odysseus's journey is his stay with this wind god. Now, Aeolus is, just one of the lesser gods, as you as you might have figured out by now. The Greeks don't simply organize the pantheon of the gods in a simplistic way. They have a lot of subcategories of the gods. So, for example, there are gods of the sky, right? We have, of course, Zeus and Apollo to some degree, but right there you see the kind of complexities where Apollo rules the sun and Aeolus rules the west winds, and then some other gods will rule other winds. So, and then below them are even kind of lesser gods or nymphs or other beings that will have something to do with these forces of nature. But for all intents and purposes, Aeolus is the west wind god. And the west wind is, of course, important because it's the one that's going to blow Odysseus towards Ithaca. And so Aeolus demonstrates one of the other key features or key ideas in the text that Homer is really trying to hammer home to us, which is hospitality, right? Aeolus sees these men coming home from Troy. He has no, strong allegiance one way or the other, it seems to be. And he's just kind of giving basic hospitality here. So he simply gives Odysseus this month of safety on his island, and then he gives him the gift of the west wind, and he holds all the other winds back so that he can get to Ithaca. All right, so he goes. He leaves Aeolus's island. But we have a problem now because what happens? He leaves and within sight of home, and while Odysseus is sleeping, the men open the bag thinking it contains gold and silver. The bad winds thus escape and blow the ships back to Aeolus's island. The king refuses to help them again, believing now that their voyage has been cursed by the gods. The discouraged mariners next stop briefly in the land of the Laestrygones, fierce cannibals who bombard the fleet of ships with boulders. Only Odysseus, his ship, and its crew of 45 survive the shower of boulders. Okay, so before we get there, I'll get to the next section. This is an interesting scene where once again, it seems Odysseus's men get the rest of them into trouble. So he's got the bag, they're on the way home, and he apparently tells the crew, don't open the bag. It's not treasure, it's just something that you don't want to open. And we have, kind of a mythological echo of the story of Pandora's box right here. Or if you want to be more kind of humanities based, we have the echo of like the Garden of Eden, right? We have the whole idea of something that's right in front of us that is meant to be a temptation, but that we're not supposed to, obviously be tempted by. The men, of course, are tempted by this and they open it, and then kaboom, the winds get set loose and then they get thrown back to Aeolus's island. And Aeolus is like, okay, that's bad. I mean, like, I think that this is pretty bad luck. I gave you a lot of help here, and still you're not doing so well. So he doesn't want to help them anymore because he thinks that, again, him being a god, he kind of detects that there's probably some sort of divine magic, curse, providence going on, right? Zeus, Poseidon, whoever is in charge of these things, is holding you guys back from home. So I'm not going to mess with this anymore. And I'm sorry, Aeolus is of course right in that assumption. So the men fail with their temptation again. They get thrown into the Lastrygones. The Lastrygones whittle away more of the men, and now he's heading on to his next stop. But he only has one ship now. And as you can see, what is happening here is that there is sort of, what would you want to call it? A whittling down. More and more of his men are being eliminated. First we had the incident with the Cyclops. Before then, actually, we had other, enemies of Troy they came across. And now we have this, right? Where they can't resist the urge, or they cannot control their urges. And it kind of almost directly, close to directly, as a result, they lose more men. Okay. Why is Homer doing this? Why is he killing off Odysseus's fleet more and more and more? Well, let's hold that off into the end, because I think at the end of book 10 at least, because I think there's one good interpretation as to why that is. And some of my students have actually had really, really profound and insightful answers as to why this is. And it's going to be important, especially at the end of this second section of the Odyssey, rather. So they leave the Laestrygones. The Odysseus and his 45 men are left, and we get this last phrase here, this last little section. The lone ship sails to Aea, however you want to pronounce it, Aea, home of the goddess Circe, or Kirke, depending on how you like your Greek, who is considered by many to be a witch. There, Odysseus divides his men into two groups. Eurylochus leads one platoon to explore the island, while Odysseus stays behind on the ship with the remaining crew. Okay, so we are, of course, approaching a very famous character in the Odyssey known as Circe, or Kirke. She is a goddess. She is a goddess, or a nymph, if you want. One of the lesser gods, who has powers that we, in Greek mythology at least, are going to identify as witchcraft, or as some kind of overt magic. Not the sort of divine magic, apparently, that we see, like Zeus and Poseidon, Apollo, Athena, and all these other gods exude, almost kind of their natural being. This is something different. She uses potions and spells and other kind of things to kind of enhance her powers or do stuff like this. And I can't remember the author, but there was recently, in the past, like, 10 or 15 years, a novel that someone wrote, a fiction novel entirely about Circe, and she does a really good job explaining how, or kind of imagining how her powers work in contrast to the normal powers of a god. So in any case, guys, we have essentially what is a new fantastical element here, which is magic, which is kind of magic that is different from divine powers. Okay. So they land on her island. They get a crew, or a part of the crew goes off to investigate. And then Eurymachus comes back, or Eurylochus, sorry. Eurylochus comes back and he reports this to Odysseus. Let's see what and the rest of the crew. Let's see what he says. In the wild wood, they found an open glade around a smooth stone house, hall of Circe. And wolves and mountain lions lay there, mild in her soft spell, fed on her drug of evil. None would attack. Oh, it was strange, I tell you. But switching their long tails, they faced our men like hounds, who look up when their master comes with tidbits for them, as he will, from table. Humbly those wolves and lions with mighty paws fawned on our men, who met their yellow eyes and feared them. Okay. So this is the opening passage that we get as we're getting the description of Circe's house from the scout who saw it. So if you want the details of what happened here, Eurylochus and his men go out, and then he comes back alone to tell Odysseus what he saw. He's giving him this story. He's saying, in a flashback, we went to Circe's hall, and then this is what happened. So here we have the first couple questions answered, this introduction to Circe's hall. Number one, what weakness of character do Odysseus' men seem to be suffering from? Well, this is, what would you say? An interesting point. Okay. So we found the Hall of Circe. We didn't get any description yet as to what they're suffering from, except maybe we could imply like curiosity, it could seem, lack of, what do you want to call it? Lack of self-control. Again, that is going to be a major theme and idea in the Odyssey is the danger of not being able to control yourself. So I think what this question is referencing is the greater passage that we see up here, right? So with the whole incident with Aeolus. And of course, I think Homer is very much aware that what he's doing there is setting us up for what's about to happen. And I think which is even more clearly setting us up for what's about to happen in book 16, as we're going to see. So you have continuous repetition of this idea of the lack of self-control, the danger of temptation, right? We saw it with the Lotus Eaters. We saw it again in some small part with Polyphemus, with the men kind of eating his cheese and all this kind of stuff. This is a little bit more overt, as we're going to see. So basically the question is kind of guiding you to be aware of this. Okay, be aware of this character flaw as they're approaching Circe's hall. Now, number two, what is surrounding Circe's halls? Well, it's interesting. It's a kind of collection of things. It is mountain lions and wolves. Okay, so wild animals, usually carnivorous, kind of, heraldic, dangerous animals. However, what is strange here, and that's for number three, what is essentially strange about this is that these animals are not attacking anybody. They are just kind of gently fawning on Odysseus's men, which means that they are kind of like nuzzling them. They're kind of like, looking for food, but they're not like, uh, looking for food, in the form of the human beings. They're looking for kind of something else. They're looking for companionship or they're looking for help. Okay. So that's strange. Whatever is going on in this hall seems to have tamed the wild animals. Okay. That's kind of strange. The next section reads on. In the entranceway they stayed to listen there. Inside her quiet house they heard the goddess Circe. Okay, so notice here, by the way, Eurymachus, and I think the narrator is overtly referencing uh, her as a goddess. Okay. Low she sang in her beguiling voice, while on her loom she wove ambrosial fabric sheer and bright. By that craft known to the goddesses of heaven, no one would speak until Pelides, most faithful and likable of my officers, said, Dear friends, no need for stealth. Here's a young weaver singing a pretty song to set the air a tingle on these lawns and paven courts. Goddess she is or lady, shall we greet her? Okay. So they come in and or not, they don't come in yet, but they kind of approach the door. They hear singing. They hear the sweet song of Circe. For those of us who know the Odyssey and some of its more famous creatures and passages, I think you're probably safe to assume that that is another bit of foreshadowing of a song, a very important song that is going to come up in the next few books. So she's singing, and they come in, they see her weaving threads. Okay. Again, this is a common image that we see the women at the weaving of fabrics or of kind of looms and stuff like this. That, of course, is something that we haven't read. I think we're going to read actually in this particular section or collection of sections from the Odyssey. But that is one of the tricks that Penelope uses to hold the suitors at bay. I think in the original Odyssey, by now the audience would have known that. So Homer again is connecting this idea of or connecting these images of women who are clever and able to kind of deal with men in their own way because they can't compete with them physically. They're able to kind of deal with them in some other way, some other kind of clever way. And that's, again, a kind of very old archetypal image of women weaving threads. If you're a monster fan, you kind of know what I'm getting at here. It's, the idea of the spider as a symbol of the feminine danger, essentially. So interesting move by Homer here. He keeps having women at the weaving loom, sure. And again, particularly kind of clever and or noble or dangerous women, like Circe. So the men come in, they want to greet her. Okay, they're not too afraid yet. So reassured, they all cried out together, and she came swiftly to the shining doors to call them in. All but Eurylochus, who feared a snare. The innocents went after her. On thrones she seated them, and lounging chairs, while she prepared a meal of cheese and barley, and ambered honey, mixed with Pramnian wine, adding her own vile pinch to make them lose desire or thought of our dear fatherland. Okay. So, quick correction on my part. This is actually not Eurylochus speaking. This is actually Odysseus, again, continuing his story, because again, this is all flashback. So this is him actually reporting what Eurylochus must have told him, essentially. So what's happening here is they go inside. Circe is not afraid of the men. She actually invites them in pretty overtly and lays them down, puts them on the couches and offers them cheese, barley, which of course they probably are overjoyed to see because they're starving, and probably, very thirsty after being at sea for quite a while. And she gives them what's called Pramnian wine, right, which is a type of wine with something, inside of it that is her own quote unquote vile pinch, right, which is probably just a mixture of magical potions and stuff like this, magical herbs. And what is it that this wine does? Well, it is designed to remove their desire and thought of home. Now, of course, once again, Homer is making us probably think there of the lotus flowers and what the lotus flower does, right? So it basically it traps you where you are. It makes you lose desire for moving forward in your journey at all. Circe's potion does the same thing. Okay, so they drink it, and what happens next? Scarce had they drunk when she flew after them with her long stick and shut them in a pigsty, bodies, voices, heads, and bristles, that is like beard, all swinish now, though minds were still unchanged. So squealing, in they went, and Circe tossed them acorns, mast and cornel berries, fodder for hogs who rut and slumber on the earth. Okay, so what has she done here? She has transformed them into pigs. Okay, more on that in a moment. But let's take a look real quick at the next couple sections, right? The last passage here. So squealing in they went, and Circe tossed them, yada yada yada. Down to the ship, Eurylochus came running to cry alarm. Foul magic doomed his men. But working with dry lips to speak a word, he could not, being so shaken, blinding tears welled in his eyes. Foreboding filled his heart. When we were frantic questioning him, at last we heard the tale. Our friends were gone. Okay, so this is what happens. Okay, now a couple questions here. For number four, what does Circe do to Odysseus' men? Why is this symbolically appropriate? Let's use the actual proper magical language here. She transfigures them into pigs. Okay. It's a very important point for anyone studying mythology, anyone studying the fantastical sorts of genres of literature, or anyone just trying to understand symbolism and kind of quote unquote older stories in general. The idea of transfiguration is an incredibly common and incredibly popular image and feature in literature. And why is that? What does it essentially symbolic or representative of. It's just, in some sense, a simplistic, or I shouldn't say simplistic, it's a very overt representation of change. That's all it is, that there is a change happening. There's a change that's occurring. Of course, now this is magical and fantastical. It's occurring, much quicker. So what does this mean? Okay, why is this here? What is the transformation that we are seeing illustrated here? Well, a quick kind of helpful point is, and I don't think I did. I mentioned this in the last video on the Odyssey. Um, is the idea of what fantasy actually means, because that will kind of give you some insight and help you understand what it is that Homer's trying to illustrate here, and basically what everyone who uses, every author and every story that uses this feature is trying to illustrate. What does fantasy mean? Fantasy, if you break down the word into its constituent parts and its meanings, simply means to make the unseen, that is the phanta, the phantasmal, seen, okay? Fantasy, right? So it's to make whatever is phantasmal seen, to make whatever is unseen seen. Well, if you want to be, very literal about that, that could mean, oh yeah, we're literally seeing ghosts, we're literally seeing, the hidden fairies, we're literally seeing the gnomes and all this kind of stuff. I think, though, the deeper and more profound way that you can interpret that, or that you could understand that, and I think that's the way that people who wrote myths and fairy tales and fantasy literature are getting at, is that they are making something that is very profound in reality, such as the soul and what happens with the soul, such as the gods or the supernatural, and what happens with our relationship with the supernatural, and for example, morality, like good and evil. They're trying to help you understand what those things are and help you be able to see those in the only way that you and I can really see them, which is with a physical thing. Because we are physical beings, we are in the physical world. It's hard for us to understand something immaterial like the idea of a soul or God or gods plural, or even something like good and evil, right and wrong. Those are kind of abstract, non-physical things that it's hard for us to kind of see. So what fantasy helps us do is give us basically images, metaphors, or stories overtly that illustrate what those things are and what they are like to us in a much more kind of physical way, in a much more imaginative way. So transfiguration as a form of magic and as a feature in stories is exactly that. It is showing you a change that is occurring. Now, what is the change here? I teach my students that there are really only effectively three types of transfiguration. I usually teach them two, but there's technically a third. And they all are associated with directions. Okay, so there is a straightforward transfiguration. That is when you are changing something into something else that is somewhat equal to it. So, for example, if we know Harry Potter, for example, when Harry Potter and his friends drink Polyjuice potion, drink a potion that changes their physical form into the physical form of another person, that is what we would call kind of a more neutral transfiguration. You are just kind of disguising yourself. You are changing your appearance. So, for example, what's another better example of this? It's not technically fantasy. It's more kind of like science fictionist, but the character of Mystique is always what I think of in X-Men, in the X-Men comics and films. She can literally kind of disguise herself and change her appearance. That's closer to kind of neutral transfiguration. The ones that we encounter much more often are what we call evolving or devolving transfiguration. Devolving transfiguration is what you are probably much more familiar with based on your childhood stories and based on the fantasy and other kind of literature we look at today and before, which is when, as the name implies, you go from one state of being that is you and you devolve, you descend, you change into something that is lesser than what you were. For example, everyone's kind of most famous one in fairy tale literature, two famous ones in fairy tale literature, I should say, are the human into the beast, right? So, for example, the prince in Beauty and the Beast into the beast, or the prince or princess turning into a frog, right? That is a devolution. Or the evil queen turning into the hag, right? In Snow White. So this is devolution, essentially. That is exactly what Homer is showing us right here. Notice many hundreds of years earlier. So it's an idea that is very much in the human imagination from a very early point. What do we see here then? We see Odysseus's men, Greek soldiers, men with families and lives and all this kind of stuff devolving into what animals? Pigs. Okay, swine. I don't even get the dignity of being called pigs. It's being called swine, right? So, what is this showing us basically? It's showing us two things. It's showing us that there is a link and a connection between what you do and what you are, or what you consistently do and what you are. So notice what these men were doing and were engaged in. They were, what shall we say? They were tempted by Circe's, um, I would probably say what? By her, at the very minimum, her offer of hospitality, her offer of comfort. And at the most kind of aggressive level, you could say at her, her mere presence as a sexual sort of object. Because I think if you go and look up, basically, and I usually do this in class, I put up some very famous paintings of Circe. She's always depicted as a very sensual, very kind of obvious object of sexual desire. And that is essentially what Homer's saying here, is that she is, this woman, this young woman who's very attractive and, kind of drawing the men into her home and into drink, her essentially what is a lotus flower, kind of drink, and tempting them with lust to ignore or at least put aside their actual journey and duties and their ideas of what are right and wrong for now and follow her down the road of temptation, of adultery, all this kind of stuff. And notice that behavior is depicted as what? As transforming you into a pig, into a beast. Okay. So why? Because these men could not control their appetites. They could not actually control what they wanted to do, what they thought they should do. They decided to put that part of their mind aside and they just decided to follow what? Their hungers and their instincts, their hungers for comfort, their hungers for safety, their hunger for food, for drink, for sex, for whatever. And they decided to follow those desires, notice this, by the way, those instinctual animal desires, and ignore their kind of more higher moral human desires of loyalty to their captain, loyalty to their family, honor to their mission, to the gods, all this kind of stuff. They're like, no, let's forget about that. Let's just follow what we want for food and, drink and sex and this kind of stuff. Well, what's the result? It's that you become that then. Then you become an animal. You become a pig. And Circe is essentially just using her magic to kind of illustrate that. So how is she making the unseen seen? The other way you can interpret this is this, essentially. She is just simply making them into, or making whatever was inside them, whatever their souls were already like, she is just making that manifest right now. So that's two ways you can interpret it, is right. What they're doing kind of, again, leads to them, becoming this sort of thing. Homer's teaching you that, don't continue to behave like a beast, otherwise you become like a beast. And then kind of Circe's magic is essentially kind of bringing out, their true inner nature, which is animalistic and beast-like. There is some, again, I'm making a lot of connections to Greek mythology today, but there's, of course, the first werewolf, King Lycan, in Greek mythology. It is the same thing. He does the exact same thing happens to him, where he commits this atrocious act, and he effectively is a monster at that point, even though he is in the form of a man. He is just a king. The gods curse him though by transforming him into a werewolf. But again, it's kind of like we talked about with Polyphemus. It's where your punishments are really just the outworking, what would you want to say? Results, the outworking results or kind of inherent consequences of behaving the way that you behave. So, what is the result of behaving like a beast? It's that you become a beast. Okay. So, this happens. Okay. So, great move by Homer for putting this kind of magical stuff into his story. Now, for number five, what type of figure is Circe? How is she characterized? Well, she's really interesting, and she's going to get actually quite interesting in the next book, even more so. I teach my students that at the very beginning here, she's a temptress. She's very clearly tempting Odysseus's men, right? With the whole safe house thing, with the song, with her sexuality, with the food, with the drink, and all this kind of stuff. She's very clearly a figure of temptation. Okay. And she's a figure of power too. Like she actually kind of draws you in and ensnares you in a way that is quite sneaky and quite unseen. So something you might be tracking as we move through this story, definitely by the time we get to the end of it, is how is Homer characterizing women? He actually gives women a very complex sort of characterization. He is not showing them to be on equal footing with men physically or with their, what would you want to say, physical power, or even kind of divine power, if you will. Pardon me. But he definitely shows them to be just as, if not, as we're going to see in the last book of the Odyssey, if not more competent or even more moral than men. So, and again, this is a very typical, archetypal, classical way of depicting women, depending on the culture you're in, of course, but I would say generally for the more kind of like Indo-European and Western literature, we definitely see this quite often is that women, um, you know, forgive the mild sexism here. But if they are not able to always compete with men physically on the battlefield, all that kind of stuff, they find more kind of creative and more wise, more kind of tactful ways of dealing with men and getting what they want. We of course are going to see that in Shakespeare, and when we get to not just Romeo and Juliet, but of course Macbeth as well. So we see that in Circe here very clearly, I think. Okay. Now, how is he going to deal with all this? How does this get resolved? Well, let's read the summary here really quickly. Eurylochus tells Odysseus what has happened and begs him to sail away from Circe's island. Against his advice, however, Odysseus rushes to save his men from the enchantress. On the way, he meets the god Hermes, who gives him a magical plant called Molly to protect him from Circe's power. Still, Hermes warns Odysseus that he must make the goddess swear she will play no witches' tricks. Armed with the Molly and Hermes' warning, Odysseus arrives at Circe's palace. Okay, so a couple things. It's noteworthy that we get a little bit of characterization of Odysseus here. He chooses to go and save his men, even though Eurylochus doesn't want him to, and the other men probably are not so thrilled about this either. He could easily say, by the way, you guys messed up. You fell into the witch's trap. Again, after you did not listen to the obvious, or I shouldn't say listen, you haven't learned yet the obvious dangers of temptation that we just saw for the past couple, what, weeks, months. And I could just leave you here, but he doesn't do that. Okay. So once again, we are from the very beginning of the Odyssey, the book one. We had this characterization of Odysseus as a man, as a leader, as a king who wants to take care of those who are underneath him. Okay. He shows care, he shows compassion and loyalty to his men. Very good job here as a leader. So he meets Hermes. Hermes gives him the kind of the counter spell, the counter herb to Circe's powers, and he goes to her palace. Circe gives Odysseus a magic drink, but it does not affect him, and she threatens to kill her with his sword. So interesting, right? He kind of, is saying, change the men back or I will kill you, right? Pretty assertive stuff there. Circe turns the pigs back into men, but puts them into a trance. They stay for 1 year until Odysseus finally begs her to let them go home. She replies that they must first visit the land of the dead and hear a prophecy from the ghost of Tiresias. Okay, a couple things here before we move on to a very important passage. So, which is the next book. So he is trapped for 1 year by Circe. How is this? She is able to put him and his men into a trance, even though what? He was able to avoid the transfiguration thing, so he's not that dumb, right? He had the divine help with that one. The trance that they are put in is usually depicted as something like the episode we saw with the Lotus Eaters, right? So Odysseus does linger, as they like to say. He does linger around in her house, probably being seduced a little bit by the pleasures therein. And he finally is like, "Look, can we please go? I know you're definitely kind of playing some magical tricks here. Can we please just go?" She, interestingly enough, does say, yes, you can. But if you want to do so, you first have to go to the land of the dead, the underworld, and hear a prophecy. Okay, interesting motions here. We'll talk more about that in a second, but let's do a quick recap actually of this book, some things we could interpret this particular book. from this particular book. Um, First and foremost, what is Homer emphasizing here? I think he is emphasizing the idea of good and bad hospitality again, right? So we see Circe as a hostess, right? But maybe the men that were coming to, meet her, hang out with her, had kind of less than noble intentions with her. Pardon me. And she, again, has quite a harsh punishment for them. And we see once again, therefore, the negative results of temptation. And a potentially kind of a potentially sexist view of women on both ends of that issue. So you can interpret Circe as being a negative depiction of women. You could say that is therefore sexist of Homer. Why is he depicting women like this? You could also say that Circe is simply responding to how Odysseus' men were being a little bit sexist and trying to perhaps come onto her a little bit too strongly. Either way, I think is an interesting and a valid form of interpretation. So I leave that to you. The more important thing here that I want to really focus on is what we have been tracking through the Odyssey thus far, which is how to interpret this story as a sort of metaphor for our experiences in life. Now, we see here what? We see Odysseus come across another obstacle here on his journey home, on his journey towards his fundamental goal, his fundamental purpose in life. And the danger here is what? The danger that is illustrated here is what? Is yes, once again, the obstacles that can come in your way through temptation, through sexuality and this kind of stuff. But I think Homer gives us an even more vivid warning of what could become of you if you fall into these temptations. You lose, in some sense, your identity. You lose your humanity. You lose who you really could be. And that is, of course, depicted with that feature of the transfiguration magic that we saw, the devolution of Odysseus' men into beasts. Okay. So I think what he's really overtly demonstrating here, guys, is what Pinocchio demonstrated, right? Everyone should go watch Pinocchio, particularly the scene that I show in class with this one, which is the Pleasure Island scene. So you go to Pleasure Island in Pinocchio. What happens? Pinocchio and his friend Lampwick, hang out. They break stuff. They smoke cigars. They drink a bunch of beer. They play pool. All this kind of craziness. And what happens to the boys eventually is, of course, they turn into donkeys. They turn into jackasses. They lose their voice. They lose their ability to speak, to reason, to do all this kind of stuff. And they are trapped and they are made slaves then of the coachman, right? Well, that's exactly what's happening here with Circe. She is tempting men into being completely subservient to her, through the temptation of sexuality and comfort and drink and all this kind of stuff. If they fall into it, they become slaves. They become beasts, essentially, for her. They become, in some sense, a very unclean and dishonorable beast, too, depending on what culture you're in, right? A pig. So Homer is warning us here, guys, that if you don't keep going on that proper journey of life, if you keep getting sidelined, if you keep getting kind of hung up on these temptations and these bad habits, you're going to essentially devolve yourself. You're going to become a much, much weaker and more pathetic and more debased version of what you really should be. Now, last thing before we move to the next book. Some of you might have noticed I did not discuss, I discussed the kind of parallel or kind of straightforward transfiguration. I discussed the devolving transfiguration. I did not discuss the evolving transfiguration. So what does it look like when we have someone go not from a man to a beast, but from a man to a what? A superman, right? A greater man, a demigod, a god even. What would that look like? Interestingly enough, Homer does actually answer this question, but he answers it in the very last book that we're going to read in the next video. So let's continue on and we'll revisit that idea eventually. So we get to book 11. And here we have, if you're tracking this, kind of almost the middle point of the Odyssey, where Odysseus has to journey into the underworld. And a couple things I want to say about that before we go. Um, If you watched, or if you eventually do watch, our video in the Universal Materials section about the hero's journey, you'll remember that I mentioned that all journeys eventually have this point where there is a literal or a metaphorical descent the hero has to go through, kind of a lowest point, right? They have to hit rock bottom. They have to have some kind of inward reflection before they can move forward on their journey. They have to discover something. They have to go through something very painful or essentially uncomfortable before they can move on. And that essentially is almost originally illustrated right here, right? Where Odysseus, in order to actually get home, in order to achieve this goal in life that he's trying to achieve, he needs to go to the underworld. He needs to go down into the depths of the underworld. For what? What does he need down there? This is again the point of those descending images in stories. You need to go down and get something. You need to get something that's going to help you move forward in your journey. Now, again, I'm mentioning that pattern right now. Most of you can kind of come up with a story that follows that pattern. I mentioned Pinocchio a minute ago. Pinocchio does literally the exact same thing. He goes down into the belly of the whale, into the ocean, and he has to get up or bring his father back up, right, in order to achieve his quest. We see this in like The Hobbit, right? Bilbo Baggins has to go into the Lonely Mountain. He has to defeat, or at least go and find Smaug, and then bring out the Arkenstone. You know, again and again and again, we see this. Well, what is the treasure that Odysseus needs to get? It is a prophecy. Now, a prophecy, guys and gals, and a prophet for that matter, is a complicated idea for us to understand. It is not classically understood, guys. A prophet is not someone who can see the future. That is a very common misconception of what prophets really are. Prophets only quote unquote know the future or accurately predict the future because of their true power, which is the ability to see the truth of the present situation. They know something way more deeply about the truth right now than anyone else around them does. And that helps them understand, oh, this is what's going to happen next. Okay. So a prophet, if you like, is someone who can see that the train or the car is about to fall off a cliff that they're sitting on right now, except no one else can. And the prophet's the one saying, guys, we're heading off of a cliff. And they're saying, oh my gosh, you must be a prophet. You must be able to tell the future. And then they fall off the hill and crash and die. It's like, no, he wasn't able to tell the future as much as he was able to just see the situation as it was. That's what the prophets are. And that's therefore what a prophecy is basically saying, hey, if you do X, Y, and Z, or if you keep doing X, Y, and Z, this is what's going to happen. Okay. So keep that idea in mind because that apparently, according to Circe, is what Odysseus needs to get in order to move forward. So, with that in mind, let's read book number 11. Odysseus says, then I addressed the blurred and breathless dead, vowing to slaughter my best heifer for them before she calved at home in Ithaca, and burn the choice bits on the altar of fire. As for Tiresias, I swore to sacrifice a black lamb, handsomest of all our flock. Thus, to assuage the nations of the dead, I pledged these rites, and slashed the lamb and ewe, letting their black blood stream into the well pit. So, what is this imagery here? We have Odysseus going down to the underworld and speaking in front of all the ghosts that he sees there, right? So, you have to remember again, know a little bit something about Greek mythology. The afterlife of Greek mythology is imagined as a realm of being or a state of being in the earth or kind of under the earth in the underworld realm where our souls or our ghosts, our blurred and breathless dead shades dwell. And we have the kind of three-tier system that we get in most religions and most mythologies where if you are a good and noble person, beloved by the gods, all this kind of stuff, you get to go to a kind of higher field, right? The Elysium field, where you get to live out your existence a little bit more fully and more kind of peacefully. If you are kind of like, in the middle, you get to go wander the fields is where he is now. And then if you're really bad, or if you're doing something bad, you get to go to Tartarus, right, which is the place of torment, essentially, very much, a preeminent idea of like hell in Christianity. So one thing that he's doing here, though, is he's sacrificing, or he's both sacrificing and pledging to sacrifice the blood of, as you can see, lambs, ewes, and calves and heifers here. Why? Because in Greek mythology, especially in Homer, the disembodied souls in the afterlife, in the underworld, do not like being disembodied. They kind of like are they're in a limited existence, and so they kind of long for blood because, of course, blood in the ancient world is not a symbol of death; it is a symbol of life. More so, it's partially a symbol of death, but more so life. So they long for the blood, right? They want the blood. He's like, yeah, I'll give you the blood. Let me just sacrifice the stuff. I'm going to wait for Tiresias. So he does this. He sacrifices it, and the blood pours into a well pit. So you kind of imagine Odysseus, in this altar essentially, where there's this pit essentially, or this well of blood in front of him, and then all the ghosts are kind of coming around trying to get a little bit of it. And he says, "What? Now the souls gathered, stirring out of Erebus, which is the darkness, kind of like the ethereal darkness of the underworld. Brides and young men, and men grown old in pain, and tender girls whose hearts were new to grief. Many were there, too, torn by brazen lancets, battle slain, bearing still their bloody gear. From every side they came and sought the pit with rustling cries, and I grew sick with fear. Okay. But presently I gave command to my officers to flay those sheep the bronze cut down and make them a burnt offering of flesh to the gods below, to sovereign death and pale Persephone. Okay. So again, he's kind of seeing, okay, the ghosts are getting a little bit too near. It's getting a little bit too creepy in here. And he's like, guys, make sure that you sacrifice to Hades, death, right? To the god of the underworld, and Persephone, his bride, just to appease the ghosts and the god of these ghosts, essentially, right? So they do this, and I love this. Again, I love the passages that Homer writes here about all of the people who have died. Um, and this is something that kind of comes up again, more so in the Iliad than the Odyssey, which is that Homer is not a glorifier necessarily of violence. I think he actually is um, quite saddened by violence. The gore that you see in both the Iliad and the Odyssey is not always meant to be glorious. It's meant to be actually quite messed up. They don't like this stuff, and I think that's why he highlights the young people here, the brides, right, and the young men who have been cut down too early um, by by the slaughter they've gone through. It's not here, unfortunately. I should probably put it in at one of these years. But there is, of course, a passage where he sees the ghost of Achilles here, our main character from the Iliad. And Achilles, being there with Patroclus, his best friend, possibly lover, says that his whole choice to go to Troy was not worth it. Essentially, he laments his choice actually, and that's such a telling point here again with Homer's idea of death and of the limitations of life and what we really should be focusing on. He thinks war is not the right option. I think that's pretty evident, and it's going to be again hammered home, I think, pretty clearly when we see Odysseus at the very last book that we're going to read in the next video. So keep that in mind, right? It's not a guy who's glorifying violence. So he continues on. Meanwhile, I crouched with my drawn sword to keep the surging phantoms from the bloody pit till I should know the presence of Tiresias. So highlight this line if you're looking at it, if you have it in front of you. This is a phrase that's going to be repeated a couple times here. Till I should know the presence of Tiresias. Till I should know the presence of Tiresias. He's waiting for Tiresias. Tiresias is going to be the one who is his major goal, his kind of precise goal while he's in the underworld here. One shade came first, Elpenor of our company, who lay unburied, still on the wide earth, as we had left him dead in Circe's hall, untouched, unmourned, when other cares compelled us. He sighed and answered. Okay. So this is always an interesting There's going to be another example of this in a minute, but I love the idea of what Homer's doing here. He's saying, a, someone who is currently alive is able to go into the underworld, the afterlife, and see the souls of people that he knew that are dead. One of which is this guy Elpenor, who is unburied up on in Circe's halls. Now, if you remember from two videos ago, that's a big deal, right? Like you can't leave a body unburied. So Elpenor is not going to be a happy camper here. So let's listen to what he says. Son of Laertes, a great Laertes, Odysseus, master, mariner, and soldier, bad luck shadowed me, and no kindly power. Ignoble death I drank with so much wine. I slept on Circe's roof, then could not see the long, steep backward ladder coming down, and fell that height. My neck bone buckled under, snapped, and my spirit found this well of dark. Now hear the grace I pray for. Before we get to that. So what happened to Alpanor, basically? He addresses his lord and captain Odysseus and he says, I fell off the roof because I got drunk. Okay. Now, why does someone put this in here? Like, why is this here? I think for two reasons, guys. The obvious reason, of course, is I think he's once again hammering home the danger of excessive um, behavior that where we give into these temptations, whether it's with alcohol, whether it's with sex, whether it's with food, whether it's with the lotus flower, whatever, right? When we give into too much stupid, indulgent behavior, we are inviting a lessened existence on ourselves. This, of course, is, I would say, an extreme example. Actually, not all that extreme example. If you look at how many people die of drunkenness or from, any sort of overconsumption of alcohol or any sort of drunk driving sort of accidents. This is not all that uncommon, but we see Alpanor essentially bemoaning the fact that his young life was cut short in an incredibly ignoble. I love that word there, by the way. He even says it. Where is it? I could not see the long steep backwards, blah, 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 shadowed me no kindly hour. Ignoble death I drank. This is ignoble. This is not a good death. This is a very anticlimactic death. Okay. I always tease my parents sometimes when I see them doing something a little bit physically risky, like climbing on the roof or whatever. I'm not a very kind son in that sense. I always will say, like, guys, do you really want to be doing that? Because if you fall and you die right here, what a lame way to say that your 65 plus years ended by just falling up a roof, right? It's the same thing here. It's like this kid who literally fought in Troy, who was like, neck and neck with Odysseus and what's it called? Achilles and all these heroes. He falls off the roof drunk. It's like that's so lame. It's so ignoble, right? It's like you're on what's it called, survival mode of Minecraft for months and months, and then you build the grandest thing ever, and then like what, you fall off a cliff and die. It's like, come on. So he says all this, and he says what? He asks for what? Now hear the grace I pray for. In the name of those back in the world, not here, your wife, your father, who gave you bread in childhood, and your own child, your only son, Telemachus, long ago left at home. In other words, in the name of all these people that you love, please listen to me. When you make sail and put these lodgings of dim death behind, you will moor ship, I know, upon Aea Island. Here, O my Lord, remember me, I pray. Do not abandon me unwept, unburied, to tempt the gods' wrath while you sail for home. But fire my corpse and all the gear I had, and build a cairn for me above the breakers, an unknown soldier's mark for men to come. Heap up the mound there, and implant upon it the oar I pulled in my life with my companions. He ceased, and I replied. Okay. So he wants to be buried. Please bury me, because if you don't bury me, I cannot find peace, apparently. And the gods are going to be quite pissed with you if you don't bury me. Okay. So once again, that's the second reason I mentioned as to why this passage is there, is again to remind us of the need for that honor towards the dead. Okay. So a couple things, the questions here so far. Where has Odysseus journeyed? What must he do there? Kind of, we talked about that already. Okay, he needs that prophecy. He's in the underworld. Number two, Elpenor wants to be buried. Okay, desperately wants to be buried. And again, what is Homer warning us about? The warning of excessive behavior, temptation, all this kind of stuff. and the potential consequences of not listening to that, which is right an ignoble death, essentially. Okay. The next ghost. Let's see who it is. So we conversed, and grimly at a distance, with my long sword between, guarding the blood, while the faint image of the lad spoke on. Now came the soul of Anticlea, dead, my mother, daughter of Autolycus, dead now, though still living when I took ship for holy Troy. Seeing this ghost, I grieved, but held her off through pang on pang of tears till I should know the presence of Tiresias. Okay. I don't know why this for me this is one of the most haunting and kind of like sticks with me images of the Odyssey. So Odysseus is down here, he's talking to the ghost of his fallen companion, and he notices his mom. And he's shocked because last time he saw his mom was over 10 years ago when he left for Troy, and she was sitting there on the dock, with his wife and her baby and the baby. And he's like, oh, okay, mom's gonna be home when I get back, right? And sure, she's not that old and gets home, and she's gonna be back there. That's what he expects. Except now he's in the underworld and he sees her. He's like, wow. And it's like, so this is like, again, this is almost like worse than you seeing what your parents like on a memorial for some horrible tragic accident that happened, in a distant country. It's like, what? And that's what he sees. He sees her there. But he holds her off. He can't talk to her. He can't let her come and drink this blood to talk with him. Why? Because he needs to wait for Tiresias. He's looking for Tiresias first, and he kind of knows. A couple things here. I think he knows that if she comes and drinks it, then he will just want to be speaking with her. He'll want to be kind of dealing with her and talking to her, and he'll be just wrapped up in that way too much. He'll miss Tiresias, or he won't have enough blood left for Tiresias, something like that. Okay. And horrible situation here where Homer is illustrating again something really profound, I think, which is that if you have your goal in life to be moral and to live out your life as it should be lived out, transforming yourself into a truly good person with your duty to your wife and your child or your husband, depending on your gender or whatever, um, do you have to create a hierarchy? Do you have to put other things before your parents or your friends? Yes, that's kind of what he's saying here is mom is important. You do need to spend time with your mother. You need to honor your mother, no question about it. But are there things you need to actually honor more? Yes. Okay. And usually in class, I pull up, just for my more religiously minded students, I pull up the kind of famous, infamous passage of Jesus of Nazareth. I can't remember what gospel it's in. I think it's Matthew, where he basically says, unless you curse your mother and father, you are not worthy of me. That's typical Jesus, being very hyperbolic there, but it's the same idea here, which is what? The idea that you have to have some things, or there are some things rather, that are in fact more important than your family. Now, I always play the hypothetical here, which is what? Well, what if he did just speak with Anticlea, his mom? What if he did just kind of give in, notice my language, give in to the temptation of wanting to speak with mom here? If he did that, then what would happen? He wouldn't get the prophecy he needs. He would never get home. Penelope and Telemachus would be in a terrible situation, if not dead, in the coming years. Okay. So rough stuff from Homer right here. But luckily, Tiresias comes pretty soon. And keep this in mind because, like what I just said, a lot of people will interpret what I just said and what Jesus says in that gospel passages as saying, okay, you can't have mom. You got to hate your parents. You can't talk to Anticlea ever again. You got to focus on this. That's not the point. Okay, that is not it. It's just saying you need to put some things first and some things second. So keep that in mind right at the end here. But let's look at what Tiresias has to say. So we got to hold mom off. Tiresias comes in. Soon from the dark, that prince of Thebes came forward, bearing a golden staff, and he addressed me. Great captain, a fair wind and the honey lights of home are all you seek, but anguish lies ahead. The God who thunders on the land prepares it, not to be shaken from your track, implacable, in rancor for the son whose eye you blinded. Okay? So Tiresias comes forward. They address him as the Prince of Thebes, by the way, because he is from Thebes. He's a very famous mythological figure. When he was alive, he appeared in the play, the series of plays, Antigone and Oedipus the King. So he was a very famous Theban prophet. He usually, again, meaning what? Meaning that he sees things that other people do not. He sees truths and realities that other people don't. And therefore, that gives him kind of some deep insight into what the future might hold. Now, a couple things here before we read the prophecy, which is going to be extremely important for this whole story. Number four, who is the next ghost? That's of course his mother. Why is this sorrowful to him? Because he didn't expect mom to be dead. Okay, it's pretty obvious. Now, number five, why do you think Odysseus cannot speak to this ghost first? What may Homer be trying to teach us? Exactly what I was just saying, which is that there are some things more important than your family, or at very least your parents. There are, in fact, more important things than family. Now, that's where we start to lock antlers, and some teachers can headbutt me, and we can get all this kind of stuff. But at least for the the morals of the Odyssey, the morals of the vast majority of these classical pieces of literature, the Bible certainly, all teach us that there are, in fact, a lot, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are, in fact, more things that are more important than family, 100%. So the old, kind of like Godfather adage that, nah, it's all about family. It's the family, the family. This is not true. This is not accurate, at least in the eyes of these classical pieces of literature or the Bible or stuff like that. So keep that in mind. Homer trying to say, at the very least, there is something more important than your desire to connect with your mom right now. Okay. Now, what is it that Tiresias' prophecy holds? And I listed it out as three things that he must do in order to find and keep his happy home. Okay, so he says, I know what you want. I know you want to get home. Okay, but you're not going to be able to get it. Okay, unless you do these three things. Let's see what he says. First of all, anguish lies ahead. He's like, in other words, you're going to suffer. Okay. That's a great, like, Buddhistic point that he begins with. He's very much like, this is going to be a rough time for you because of what you did with Polyphemus. Okay. Because that whole crap show, you're really going to suffer here. Zeus is going to make you go through the ringers. Okay. Now, I wish we would nail that into kids' heads a little bit more overtly sometimes, but we tend to kind of shelter students quite a bit. I try to find a good balance between those two ideas, and I try to remind my students that yes, we will inherently go through a lot of tragic things in life. You are never going to be fully safe, fully comfortable in life, at least for very long, right? It's just part of the nature of reality that we're dealing with here in this world. You're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have anguish. It's just part of the story. Okay. Um, but of course, the underlying point there is that number one, you can in fact deal with it. You are in fact strong enough to deal with it, and you can find a lot of you can I shouldn't say find, yeah, you can discover a lot of meaning in your journey through that anguish. Well, like Odysseus is essentially trying to. So, what is it that he says you have to do it in order to get through it? One narrow strait may take you through his blows. In other words, there's one way, there's one narrow way. Okay. It's almost like he's, by the way, channeling the Gospels there, even though this was written before the Gospels. Um, the straight and narrow path, right? The straight and narrow path that Jesus talks about as the way to heaven. Tiresias is saying something similar. There's one way to get what you want. Denial of yourself, restraint of shipmates. Right there. Highlight that. Main point. You need to deny yourself. You need to deny the initial urges of what you want in the moment. You need to learn how to restrain yourself and aim for something more in a more disciplined way. Okay. So self-control, denial of yourself, love of others instead of just only love for yourself. I mean, like, literally, I can hear like literally every major world religion shouting like in agreement right now. That's such a universal point right there. And by the way, you also need to restrain those shipmates, right? You need to restrain your men because they haven't seemed to gotten this point yet. Okay. What's he say? When you make landfall of Thrinacia first and quit the violet sea, dark on the land you'll find the grazing herds of Helios, by whom all things are seen, all speech is known. Okay. So you're going to get on this island, Thrinacia. You're going to see the cattle, the cows, right? The herds of Helios, the sun titan. Simple as that. Now, I mean, some of us who hear that might immediately be thinking, "Oh, wait, that sounds familiar. That's from book one. Isn't that why all of his men died and couldn't get home?" Yes. Okay. And that's what Tiresias is setting up. He's like, make sure when you get to the land of Thrinacia, you see Helios' cattle, do what? Avoid those kind, hold fast to your intent. And hard seafaring brings you all to Ithaca. In other words, if you resist and avoid them, you're all going to get home safe. Simple as that. Okay. Avoid them, you'll get home. Awesome. But if you raid the beeves, if you raid them, if you eat them, I see destruction for ship and crew. Though you survive alone, bereft of all companions, lost for years, under strange sails shall you come home to find your own house filled with trouble. So if you don't avoid the cattle of Helios, you will be lost at sea alone and eventually come home under strange sails. Now, again, attentive readers will say, wait a minute, that sounds exactly like what Polyphemus prophesied, that you'll be coming home under strange sails. And it is, okay? That's exactly the same point. It's almost like it's fate, right? That's what's going to happen if you don't follow the proper behaviors and honor of the gods. He says what? You'll find your own house filled with trouble, insolent men eating your livestock as they court your lady, your wife. I shall make those men atone in blood. But after you have dealt out death in open combat by stealth to all the suitors, go overland on foot and make fair sacrifice to Lord Poseidon. A ram, a bull, a great buck boar, turn back and carry out pure hecatombs at home, and all wide heaven's lords, the undying gods, to each in order. Okay? So you're gonna go home. You're going to see all the suitors there doing all the stuff they're doing. You got to kill them all. Kill every single one of them. Then you're going to go give thanks to Poseidon. You're going to go make an offering to Poseidon. And then what? Then a seaborn death, soft as this hand of mist will come. I'm sorry, soft as this hand of mist will come upon you when you are wearied out with rich old age, your country folk in blessed peace around you. And all this shall be just as I foretell. So, in other words, if you do that, you'll die at a rich old age with everyone at peace around you. That's interesting. I mean, that sounds like a happily ever after. So he's basically laying out for us, if you want to look back over here at the questions, the three things that you need to do, Odysseus, if you want to get home and have your happily forever after. What are those three things? Number one, denial of yourself. You need to deny yourself. And the form that kind of, and restrain your shipmates, and the form that kind of comes in is resisting the whole obsession or the whole urge to eat the cows of Helios, right? That's one big one. Okay. Don't eat the cows. Simple as that. Now, that sounds strange to us. And again, most of us who are reading this kind of in this particular century, in this particular time period, are reading like, what's up with the cows? Like, what are they magical? What's the deal? I think the whole idea, guys, of eating the cows of Helios is simply this. It is a metaphor, it's a symbol, it's an act that represents what? Dishonoring the gods, okay? Lack of respect for the gods completely, right? So I think the defiling of Helios's cattle, of eating these sacred cows, would be seen as simply that, as this act of like complete disrespect of the gods and of sacredness, like of you just defiling something that's very sacred in this world, and you will be punished for it, therefore. So you need to restrain yourself and kind of honor the gods. That's kind of going to be 2 points in some sense. And the other one, of course, is you need to get rid of those suitors. Okay, you got to get rid of the suitors and remove them from your house. You got to kill them all. Now, we'll talk more about why you have to kill them in the third video, the one after this. Um, but suffice it to say, guys, I think the suitors, I think we discussed, we hinted at a little bit in the first book. The suitors represent, for our interpretations here, they represent dysfunctional behavior within your home or within your family. You need to get rid of that. You need to remove that. That peace you were describing that you want in Ithaca ain't going to exist if these sort of men or this sort of behavior is allowed to continue existing. You have to remove it. Okay, it has to be gone symbolically in this mythological story by killing everyone, by killing them, right? So that needs to be done. Okay, so control yourself, remove the dysfunction, honor the gods. Okay, because notice what he says is the last thing you got to do there. You got to go and sacrifice to Poseidon. You got to give thanks to Poseidon. You didn't do all of this essentially on your own. You did it with Poseidon and other gods as help. And if you do all this, happily ever after. Okay, so he tells him all this, and then Odysseus begins to leave. Now let's read the passage here. Well, what's going on? The summary passage says what? Odysseus speaks to the shade of his mother. She tells him that Penelope and Telemachus are still grieving, for him rather, and that his father Laertes has moved to the country, where he too mourns his son. In other words, what? First of all, notice what's happening here. So he spoke to Tiresias. Now he's allowed to speak to mom. Okay. So again, whether it's Homer in the Odyssey here, Mr. G screaming at you in class, or Jesus in the Gospels, it's not that you need to, as Jesus says, hate your parents. It's not that I'm saying your family is not important. It's not that Homer is saying you can't speak to your mom. It's saying what? You need to order things properly. So, like I just had this conversation yesterday, actually, with my best friend. Uh, how do you order your life like this? Because let's say you're kind of a maturing person, you're getting into your 30s, all this kind of stuff. You have or frankly, even if you're in your teens, you have your family, your friends, your career aspirations, your care for your own character, for your own well-being and your own kind of moral development as a person, trying to transform into a better person. And then you also have your romantic relationships, right? So how do you organize all those things? Does one of them go in front of the other? Yes. Yes. Some of them have to, for example. So for instance, when you get married, when you fully devote yourself for life, hopefully, to another boy or another girl, that person then becomes effectively the person you are responsible to the most above other people. So you, in some sense, are putting them above your family and your friends. Okay. They are your other half, as the Greeks would say, right? You are one flesh, as the Bible would say. So that person has to come first. And so by Odysseus putting Anticlea, his mother, aside before he can speak to Tiresias to learn how he can get home to his wife and his kid, that is a kind of a mythological version of that. And I think Jesus is saying the same thing, by the way, not to get too deep into the Bible, but he's basically saying what? Is that yes, you can love your mother and father, but if they are not in line with, if they are not kind of what would you want to say? How would he put it, or how would they put it in the Bible? If they are not guiding you and kind of leading you and helping us towards the kind of holy life that we should be living in, a good and moral life, they need to come second, essentially. And you fundamentally just need to love God, as the Bible would say, more than you love your family, or above that point. Now, again, does that mean that you don't love your family, therefore? No, because what do we see here? With Odysseus, we see no, he very much does love his mother, and he still is able to talk to her quite a bit, apparently. So it's not that you don't have the relationships at all, it's that you just need to put them in proper order. Yes, you have time to make with your friends. Yes, you have time to make with your mother and father. Yes, you have time to make with your wife. Yes, you have time, for anything you want fundamentally, but it needs to be put in order. So some things do come first. Some responsibilities come first. For Odysseus, it's with his family, or I'm sorry, with his wife and child. So he speaks with her. She tells him everything that's happening, and they're able to have their kind of, mother and son reunion very sweetly. And Odysseus' mother explains that she died from a broken heart. Okay, so she, no, that's some ways to interpret that as like, she got too sad and then she just kind of actually from the stress died. Some people say that she actually like killed herself, depending on how you interpret the story, because suicide is a little bit different in the ancient world before the Bible. So maybe. Odysseus also speaks with the spirits of many great ladies and men who died, as well as those who were being punished for their earthly sins. Okay, hence, Achilles and other characters from the Iliad. Filled with horror, though, Odysseus and his crew set sail. Okay, they're just too like they kind of delve a little bit too deep into Tartarus and the ghosts there, and they're like, all right, time to get out, let's go. So they leave. Okay, so Odysseus has gone through his descent. He finds the prophecy he needed and he starts to ascend. Okay. And he's like, okay, now I know what I got to do. Now I know what the situation is at home. I got to get home. Okay. I know the pathway there. So, why did he need to come here and speak with Tiresias? Well, imagine if he didn't. Imagine if we didn't just discuss everything that we just said. Imagine if, like, not necessarily like I'm the one who's going to teach it to you, but imagine if you never learned any of those things we just discussed in this book from anyone. Then, and if you didn't know it, even worse then, what would life be like? What would life be like for Odysseus if he never actually went here and got this information? He'd be stuck with Circe forever. He'd be dying at sea. This would be just a terrible end of the story. So he needed this very harsh and very important, but somewhat uncomfortable truth and prophecy in order to move forward. Okay, that's why he needed to do this. He needed to journey deep into the underworld, journey, if you want to be all metaphorical, inside himself. He needed to go through something very deep and understand these truths and move forward. Now, this kind of again brings forth the idea, one of Homer's major ideas, which is what? This idea of life as a journey of development and maturity and growth. So Odysseus, I think at this point, has gone through his turning point and he's going to be moving upwards quite a bit more closely now. Okay. Okay. That's book 10. Now, I believe, let's see real quick. Book 12. Yeah, book 12 and book 16. We're gonna speed through. I always speed through book 12 because it's a lot of description about um, the underworld. I'm sorry, not the underworld, but monsters and stuff like this. So we're gonna cut the video off here because we've been going for quite a while. We're gonna split the second section up into two sections. So we'll finish book 12 and also book 16 up in the next section so that I can actually go into as much depth as I want to. So there are your questions for those past two books. We'll finish up the next two books in the next video. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time. Bye.